when things aren't going well with the young people in our lives, it really harms our well-being. There are very few people who feel 1,000% confident that they know exactly what to say to a young person who's on the precipice of a poor decision or who, is facing an uncertain future. And it causes us to do something that I call Grownsplaining, which is
You're
where,
basically explaining my parenting style, unfortunately.
yeah,
But yes, go on.
yeah. I mean, and now I'm going to mansplain Grownsplaining to you, but it's just this simple idea that we say, I, with thy smart adult brain, who has survived to at least right now, I must know what I'm doing. And therefore, the contents of my logic and reasoning must be accurate and trustworthy, etc. And you, by virtue of being a hormonally charged, poorly self-controlled teenager, lack that expertise and wisdom. And frankly, you haven't survived as long as I have. So now I'm just going to export the contents of my thoughts into your ill-formed brain. And yet, what happens when you Grownsplain is the disrespect of implying that young people cannot think, that they can't make their own choices. And once we've disrespected young people, then we have basically pushed them away and caused them to close their ears. And now I'm frustrated, I'm terrified. And the definition of a bad stressor is a bad outcome that feels like we can't control.
What we're seeing today is really the first time in human history where there's this really expanded gap between the onset of puberty and the onset of neural mechanisms that facilitate the regulation of emotion, the regulation of thought. And so this is really a prescription for disaster.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dharma Lab. I am very honored and excited to be joined by two really remarkable people. Most of you watching or listening will know Dr. Richard Davidson, Richie, one of the eminent neuroscientists on the planet today. And we're joined also by another very eminent scientist, David Yeager, who's really one of the leading researchers on the topic, not only of adolescent development, how we can understand the ages from 10 to 25, but especially this idea of interventions. How can we support younger people in living with more balance and find ways to bring out the best in them? So he literally wrote the book From 10 to 25 on the science of motivating young people. That's the title of his book. It's a fantastic book. Highly recommend it. And we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk a little bit about just the misunderstandings that many of us can have. And I'll speak as a parent. I'm certainly one of these people who just can feel like you just don't understand the younger generation. It's probably something that every generation in the history of human civilization has always felt about earlier generations or younger generations. But then we're really especially excited to get into this topic of wise interventions. What are the little things we can do to support less suffering and hopefully more thriving and flourishing, both in the young people in our lives, or if you happen to be a young person in your life, and also just more harmony in our homes and workplaces and so on. So why don't I just maybe start it off with you, David, if you just want to share, maybe start with the sense of just feeling like we just don't understand young kids today. I feel like an old curmudgeon, like young kids. I just, what's going
Right.
on? So what is it? What should we understand? And where do we go astray and maybe having some misconceptions?
Yeah. I mean, I think first, thanks so much for having me on. And it's an honor to be here. It's funny when things aren't going well with the young people in our lives, it really harms our well-being, right? I mean, if you ask older folks, like anything from my age and older, what you're most worried about, it's usually like my kids, my grandkids. We did a study of stress where we asked kids about stress, and they said, they're worried about either being judged and evaluated mostly. But then we asked like grandparents, and they're like, I'm stressed that my kids and my grandkids are going to make terrible choices and I can't stop them or do anything about it. And so it's just a way of saying that, to the extent that we care about our well-being, we got to care about how things are going with the young people in our lives. And given that, it's interesting to ask, well, how do we think it is going? And it's like not going well. There are very few people who feel 1,000% confident that they know exactly what to say to a young person who's on the precipice of a poor decision, or who has already made a poor decision and needs to readjust, or who, is facing an uncertain future. And so why is that? And in my book, I write about a lot of hypotheses we have, but I think in general, what happens is that if you haven't had any measure of success in your life or feel like you've overcome things, then before we give advice or interact with other people, we have a kind of simple checklist. Like, well, did I make good choices? Yeah. Therefore, I must know exactly what someone else should do. And now I'm just going to tell you exactly what I think and what you should do. And it's like, it's a kind of simple logic, but it's a little bit flawed. And it causes us to do something that I call Grownsplaining, which is
You're
where,
basically explaining my parenting style, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But yes, go on.
Yeah. I mean, and now I'm going to mansplain Grownsplaining to you, but it's just this simple
Utterly
idea that we
ineffective.
say,
I can vouch for that.
yeah, like I, with my smart adult brain, who has survived to at least right now, I must know what I'm doing. And therefore the contents of my logic and reasoning must be accurate and trustworthy, etc. And you, by virtue of being a hormonally charged, poorly self-controlled, idiotic teenager, lack that expertise and wisdom. And frankly, you haven't survived as long as I have. So there's no telling what kind of, trouble you're up to with your decision making. So now I'm just going to export the contents of my thoughts into your ill-formed brain. And look, I understand that. I mean, I understand how we have the curse of knowledge. We trust our expertise if we're an expert, and so it causes us to do this. And that is how then most adults construe the young people in their lives, and that doesn't feel good.
I'm living a version of this right now, and Richie and I are both parents. Richie's a little bit further along, but we've been through this.
Yeah.
And it's so challenging when you're in the middle of it, right? Because you do have that perspective where you feel like, okay, I could see how this could go poorly or well, and I could see it seems very clear, like, oh, I can see how it's going poorly. And of course, you also know that if I just come in and either just try to take control of it, that doesn't work. Trying to tell them what to do, that doesn't work. Being hands off sometimes also doesn't work. And it kind of feels like you have got like a series of bad options. Richie,
Yep.
I'm kind of curious, as a neuroscientist, this is one of the most fascinating periods of brain development, right? Like this is very interesting with just what's happening between the ears and with the nervous system through this arc, from 10 to 25, and specifically with some windows in there where there's so much change happening. But maybe you could share a little bit of that perspective, Richie. And I'm also curious how knowing that, or if knowing that, changed how you dealt with this. Because you lived through this too. It's one thing to know this intellectually, but it's another thing, like you're working with your kids, and how do you use this knowledge?
Yeah. Well, first, let me just say, since I'm just now coming on, to just say that I'm so happy to be here with David Yeager. I've known of David's work for a long, long time. I know his mentor at Stanford, Carol Dweck, quite well. And his work has really been inspiring to a lot of the stuff we do. So it's great to have you. Regarding the specific question that you're asking, Cort, one of the really fascinating things to observe is that the onset of puberty today is occurring much earlier than it did, say, 100 years ago. And that's true, for all Western countries in which this has been examined. And the acceleration of pubertal onset is really quite profound. I mean, there are certain subgroups in the United States now where the onset of puberty is occurring before the age of 10. And yet the regulatory circuits in the brain are on their own maturational cycle, and they don't fully mature really until the mid-20s. What we're seeing today is really the first time in human history where there's this really expanded gap between the onset of puberty and the onset of neural mechanisms that facilitate the regulation of emotion, the regulation of thought. And so this is really a prescription for disaster. And some of the train wrecks that we see are really a product of this. And, you know, in my own case as a parent, I have two kids. One of them is now in his mid 30s. The other is in her early 40s. And I have four grandkids. And I'm very happy to be at this stage of life. But let me tell you, it wasn't always easy. And as Cort knows, we went through a very challenging time with our son during adolescence. And he's now happily married. He has two amazing kids. He's an amazing father, and he's become a school psychologist. And he's also what I think of as a poster child for plasticity. And so, you know, during the time we were in the thick of it, I would say that my intellectual knowledge was useless in enabling me to address things. And I wish I had had some of the insights that actually David shares in his book and in his research. And I wonder, David, if you can maybe tell us a little bit about the different parenting styles that you talk about and how this may be of real benefit to parents today in relating to their kids, perhaps in a way that's different than I did in the throes of these challenges, and maybe that Cort struggles with periodically with his son.
Daily.
Yeah.
Just to be precise, daily.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we have four kids, so we're, plenty of mistakes happening in my house. My wife has not read my book. She was like, "You should read Dr. Becky's book." That was her take on it. Or she's like, or I should write the book. I don't know. I mean, every parent thinks they're doing it a little bit right. Look, so I didn't write the book where I felt like I had all the answers and I was going to explain them. It was more like the book I needed to read as an everyday parent with, kids have all kinds of issues. We have three super ADHD boys, and, a very kind of like perfectionist daughter. And, we have all kinds of challenges. And what I liked the most in doing the reporting for the book was interviewing this amazing parenting coach. And I'll tell you a little bit about what she does. But her name is Lorena Seidel. And I met her because I met some families on the East Coast outside of New York where their kids are every bit as crazy as my kids. And yet they took their plates to the sink on purpose without needing to be reminded 19 times. And I was like, how is this possible? Can't be true. Is there mind control happening? Do you have electric shock collars on these children? And they're like, no, we have this parenting coach. I'm like, I got to talk to her. And if you're wondering if I talked to her more than I needed to write the book so I could get free parenting advice, the answer is yes. And so what she described is this process of still being very demanding in terms of what you expect kids to do and the independence and autonomy you expect them to exercise, from everything around household chores to resolving conflict with their peers. But what stood out the most, and it's more than this, but what stood out the most is that she almost always is asking questions. She wasn't sitting there telling kids what they should do. And when you Grownsplain, then again, your kids are fighting in one room. You're like, don't you know you're being so loud and the neighbors can hear you? Or don't you know you're being so mean to your sibling and this is a big problem? And then now you're going to give your sibling psychological problems. And then I'm going to have to pay for a therapist. It's going to cost me thousands of dollars and I'm going to have to take you and you won't be able to go to the toy store anymore because I'm going to be busy driving everybody to therapy. Or, that's what we're tempted to do, is to tell, right? And she doesn't do that. And she asks questions, and I can explain a little more what that is. But her philosophy is what kids have to figure out how to do, as their brains are changing in the way that Richie described. What it means for the prefrontal areas to be developing is that it's figuring out how to pursue goal-directed behavior in a culture. Is that you're adapting to what's going to help you survive and what's going to help you thrive and so on. And so, an important goal you have to be able to figure out is how to resolve conflict. And if every time kids are in conflict, we panic and resolve it as quickly as possible to try to reduce screaming and embarrassing behavior, then they're not actually having to pursue the goal-directed behavior. The only goal they have to pursue is how to basically subjugate their emotions to the will of the parent who's telling them to be quiet. Lorena said to me, stood out to me. She's like, I was tired of refereeing fights. Like, I don't want to be the referee anymore. Like, I want them to figure out how to referee stuff. And so it's a little Socratic process that she goes through when she manages conflict with siblings. Now, almost every parent listening to this is like, that's cute, ivory tower professor, but that's impossible, because what really happens is the macaroni's burning on the stove, the repairman's at the door, you're late for practice, and your kids are punching each other in the face. And that's not the time to have a long conversation. And of course, I understand that. There are times where you just need to separate kids. And yet, if all you ever do is try to basically suppress your kids' intense negative emotions, then they're never going to learn. And you've created more problems for yourself. And it's not just good parents who are primarily engaging in this kind of questioning practice. It was great teachers. So a great teacher doesn't just walk around and tell kids right or wrong in terms of the math problems or whatever. They don't walk around just saying, oh, you made an error here, here's how you fix it. They're really good at having kids go talk to other students about what they got wrong, and then they jointly problem solve when they're doing like quiz corrections or test corrections. Every great teacher I've seen has a way of peers collaborating on mistakes and fixing them. Now, novice teachers have a hard time doing this. Great teachers do it. But that's kind of what Lorena's doing with the kids. And I similarly, I followed the NBA's best shooting coach, this guy named Chip England, who is now is at the Oklahoma City Thunder. They went from the worst shooting team in the NBA to the best shooting in 3 years. Now they're at risk of setting the NBA wins record. It's incredible. He doesn't really sit there saying, your finger's wrong, you're jumping wrong. Like, he's not just listing all the stuff you're doing wrong. You take a shot and he's like, how did that feel? So he's asking you to figure it out in your head so that all the other hours of the day when you're practicing, you're able to have a coach in your own head, even when he's not there, so you can improve. And I think that's a good metaphor for what great parents are doing. It's like, my goal is not to have you only know how to behave when I am here able to tell you how to behave. My goal is for you to have the reasoning skills and have a coach in your own head to resolve conflict. And that parenting style is something I call the mentor mindset, and I contrast it with several other options in the book.
And I wonder, David, if you would take as a friendly amendment when you say that when the coach is no longer there, to have it in their head, also to have it in their body. Because it's not pure reason, but it's reason plus a kind of emotional decision making, which is at least in part based in the body as well as in the head. Would you agree?
Yeah. So in my book, I write about the example of distress. And I use the example of my daughter, Scarlett, when she's a 7th grader, and she was auditioning for first chair for cello. And I don't know what first chair is. She said it was a big deal. I'd never heard of it. But she got in the car and had butterflies in her stomach, she told me. And, a lot of parents call the school and say, my kid can't come to school. They feel sick, right? But I knew I was writing this book, and that if I did that, my teenage daughter would call me a hypocrite for the rest of my life. So I couldn't do that, or parents say, suck it up, stop whining, and those two approaches are what I would call the former protector mindset, where I'm trying to protect you from any more distress and by removing expectations and standards. And the latter is what I call an enforcer mindset, which is my way or the highway, yell, tell, blame, and shame, demand a lot, but not support you. And I knew I couldn't do that. I was going to try to be what I call this mentor mindset. And, but she was going through a very visceral experience, like described her butterflies in her stomach, sweaty palms, racing heart, heavy breathing, in addition to the mental anxiety and worries about what it would mean if she failed. What would her friends say if she didn't do well? Would she disappoint her instructor or her parents, etc.? Okay. So at the time, I was just finishing up a paper with James Gross on a new kind of reappraisal tactic that we worked on, what we call synergistic mindsets. And the idea, building on Ali Crum's work as well at Stanford, and the idea was to help kids at the time reappraise or reinterpret that physiological arousal of distress as, first of all, a sign that you've chosen to do something ambitious and important that not everyone would do. So it's basically a sign that you've been bold, and it's not a sign you're going to fail. It's a sign that you are the kind of person who has something you care about, and that it's hard things, and that you've put yourself in that position. Great. And then the physiological part is actually your body mobilizing resources to get oxygenated blood to your brain and your muscles to help you perform better. At any rate, that's what I was going to say to Scarlett. And then I was like, Scarlett, what do you think I'm going to say? And then she goes, oh, you're going to tell me that the butterflies on my stomach are a sign that I'm doing something ambitious and important that I care about, and that my racing heart is getting oxygenated blood to my brain and muscles so I can perform at the level of my preparation. And I was like, yes, that was exactly what I was going to say. How did you know? And she reminded me that 2 years earlier, when she was water skiing in a lake outside of Chicago, in Lake Geneva, I was holding the skis behind her. She's floating in the water. She had said the same thing about being nervous. And I was like, you're getting oxygenated blood to your muscles to hold onto the rope so you can pop up. And you wouldn't be afraid if it wasn't amazing, because human beings are not supposed to walk on water at all. And certainly not behind a 40-mile-per-hour engine on a lake. So skiing is unbelievable. But if you hold on, you're going to pop up. So you're nervous about safety for a legitimate reason. But once you're up, you're going to have the time of your life. And she did just that, had the time of her life, and remembered it 2 years later. So Richie, to answer your question, I think often, if we take the moment to be a mentor and help people reappraise, rather than our standard approach to negative emotions as a parent is suppression, right? It's like, stop yelling, fighting with your brother, stop crying. We tell our kids to stop crying all the time. When kids are babies, we exploit object permanence, right? Like, there's a toy they want, they start crying about it. Most parents hide the toy, and the kid's like disappeared. It's amazing. That's a metaphor for what we do throughout kids' lives, is we try to hide distress from them. And my argument is, take the moment to be a mentor, and then in both their bodies and their minds, they have almost like an experiential metaphor to apply going forward to new stressful circumstances. And that's what happened with Scarlett, at least in that one case.
That's beautiful. I love that.
It's amazing. One thing that's amazing about this is how much this parenting dynamic maps perfectly onto the way we relate to ourselves and our own inner experience. I mean, we're basically the enforcer or the protector is usually how we relate to our own inner discomfort, our own emotional experiences. Either we're trying to tell ourselves we shouldn't experience what we're experiencing, or to stop feeling what we're feeling, or we try to safeguard it somehow. So it's either super judgy and harsh, or avoidant and just trying to, smooth things over. And so in many ways, when I think about a lot of the work we do is around meditation and, teaching people skills to work with their internal states, it's actually very similar. It's a very similar kind of process. You're learning to be your own inner mentor versus your inner enforcer or your inner protector, and seeing that the growth edge actually is when you can come to it with curiosity versus the judgment or the protective mechanism.
Yeah, that's hard. I think I didn't put this in the book, but I have another story about one of my close friends who was at an elite institution and wasn't going to be renewed for his fourth year review. And I thought it was preposterous. He was amazing, and any institution would be lucky to have him. But he then had to interview for new jobs, but he had 5 kids. And so he got one good interview, but some other bad ones. And this was his shot to give a job talk, nail the interview, to provide for his family. And he could not write the talk. And it was just total threat type, stress. And then it's just all the classic stuff that Sion Balak and other people have talked about. Once you're judging and evaluating, and then everything you write and say sounds dumb, right? Then now you're like, wait, am I the kind of person who can't write a good talk and do this job well? And maybe the fact that I'm so stressed about it means that I'm not this top performer who can do anything. And then if I'm not this top performer, I can do anything, then aren't they right to not want me in this job? And so wouldn't they be justified in evaluating my talk as poorly? And if that's the case, then how could I even give a good talk that will go over well? Because we all know that I don't deserve to. So that's the kind of narrative that happens so quickly, right? And I had to be like, you got to challenge appraise the shit out of this. It's like, you have chosen to do world-class research in an amazing way that's going to change the world. And then you're going to tell other professors about it so they can be smarter because only you did this research and it's incredible. And now they're fortunate that they get to hear from it. And after that, they're going to be like, this is an incredible scientist that we want. And so that stress is actually a sign that you have chosen to give an ambitious talk in front of other world experts and impress them with what you've done for the last 20 years. But I had to say that, I don't know, every hour for the whole weekend as we were rewriting his job talk. And of course, he gave the job talk, he landed it, got tenure. But it was like really touch and go for like 3 days. And even psychologists have to remind themselves to challenge appraise the situation, not make a threat appraisal.
So part of this is this is how we relate to ourselves. So if we're relating to our own inner experience this way, to be curious and to invite this kind of conversation, I could see a lot of strengths to, as you're learning how to parent, also be relearning how you're relating to your own inner experience. So they're sort of mutually reinforcing. And a lot of this gets to something Richie and I were talking about earlier, and that was very much, part of your earlier work, and you could see carrying through even to what you're doing these days, which is mindset, the work you did with Carol Dweck. So much of this is really just getting, like you could see in the example you just gave, with your friend, like we just get in these stuck mindsets. We're just like, this is what's going on. This is the reality. This is who I am. And it just is what it is. And that's it. There's no fluidity here. I'm stuck. And a lot of this is seeing that, no, everything is always a work in progress. Everything, we're always learning and growing and adapting. Everything is an opportunity to lean in and change and adapt. And so a lot of this, maybe you could just speak a little bit about the arc of your career, how, the early work on mindset and maybe what's going on now leading into the intervention work and wise interventions.
Yeah. Yeah. And just a minor point that one of the reasons why I like Ali Crumb's research so much on her mindset work is this idea of stressed about being stressed. And it's the secondary appraisal of like, wait, what does it mean that I'm the kind of person who's stressed out about this? And so what I like about that is once you grant that that's a thing that happens to us, that it's not simply the stressor we're worried about. It's the fact that I'm the kind of person who's so distressed, right? Then you start, it's more obvious why a shift in mindset can help you, because oftentimes it doesn't feel like we can change the underlying stressor, but it does feel like you can change your interpretation of what it means that you're stressed out by it. So to give you another example is if like your kids are misbehaving in public, right? And other parents are watching your misbehaving children. What is your worry? Well, in America, I learned not everyone thinks this way, but in America, we get really mad at our kids, not because of the behavior they're doing, but because of the signal it's sending to all these strangers that are judging and evaluating me as a crappy parent, right? And you're like, stop that thing right now, And it's like your kids are misbehaving on the bus and everyone's like, this parent can't even control their own kids. And I say in America because when I was in sabbatical at Stanford, we had some visiting scholars who were also at Casbus, center up on the hill, and they were from another country, and their kids just roamed free all the time, and they didn't worry at all about what other American parents thought about their parenting styles. And I just looked on it with envy the whole time, like, man, it's like
it's so true. I've spent a lot of time in Tibetan communities, and it's just like kids are just literally running crazy, and like nobody cares. I'm like, why?
Nobody's worried about the secondary appraisal of strangers think I'm
so
a garbage
true.
parent.
So true.
I was like, it must be like, the jealousy you have for Dory and Finding Nemo. Like, there's no memory, so there's no fear. Anyway, and so I think that because secondary appraisals matter so much, then mindsets. It's one reason why mindsets can matter for how we cope with things. And so earlier in my career, I tried to run with that, and it was, all right, well, can we identify a really problematic appraisal people are making of situations that they're chronically making, and that is making a situation worse than it needs to be? Okay, and you can think about that for almost any social problem, and I was focused on youth mostly. So it could be like my dissertation work was, first week of high school, you see your middle school friends in the hallway, and they ignore you. Does that mean you're going to have no friends in high school? You'll be alone at your high school reunion in 20 years. You'll die alone, right? Or does it mean that they're insecure and trying to make new friends, right? And so it kind of matters which interpretation you make if you're a ninth grader going through that, right? And then there's the classic fixed mindset of intelligence, right? I do a math problem, I get a low grade. Does that mean I'm an idiot? My teacher hates me? Or is it that I've chosen to take a hard class and I'm in the process of learning, and the teacher's trying to identify my mistakes so that way they can help me to learn more, right? So it matters with the appraisal. Okay. So once you kind of have like a dichotomy of like good, kind of better and worse appraisal, then the question is, what do people already chronically believe about the world that makes them habitually result in that worse appraisal, right? And that's, of course, Carroll's big shift, because Carroll didn't invent attribution or appraisal theory, right? But it's the idea that your theory about the world is going to shape the situational appraisals that you make in any given situation. So if I think in the high school bullying case, in general, if I think the world is made up of winners and losers, bullies and victims, and that the task is to end up in the winner group, or at a minimum in the bully group, not the victim group, right? Then I'm on the lookout for early information in the first week of high school about which bucket applies to me. And I'm really worried if it seems like I'm headed in the loser, have no friends group, because now that's going to determine the rest of my life. So I'm over-interpreting and I'm over-appraising because it feels like information about some fixed category I can never change. And that was like, that's the fixed mindset insight around the theories of personality research we did early on. And so then the thought was, well, if I could convince you that actually these labels aren't permanent, that they don't determine you for life, people can change. And also people's opinions of you can change over time. Or people who are mean to you, they might be different later and they might see you for who you are. If I could convince you that those labels aren't so all or nothing, then I could hopefully prevent you from making a bad secondary appraisal, like my life is over. And so we, for a long time, would just do interventions to give people a different belief about intelligence can change, your personality can change, your stress, is something that you can harness and use rather than be overwhelmed by. Or even your schoolwork isn't pointless. Your schoolwork is a route to meaning and purpose and contribution, because you can use your stronger brain to change the world. Okay, so these were, messages. Yeah.
Curious, just to follow up. So the way you put it is, if you can convince people of the more adaptive, positive mindset, then all these benefits would accrue. And in your work, you've beautifully demonstrated that fact repeatedly in a variety of different kinds of studies. One of the questions that arises from the kind of work that Cort and I have done is, um, a person may be readily convinced of this. How do you help them remember that they have been convinced of this when the rubber meets the road and they're in a really tough situation? How do they remember? Because at those times, people often forget. And I'm sure you've thought about this, and I'd love to hear your views of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think early on, what probably surprised people the most about the work, it is not that I could get somebody to feel better 30 seconds later after I stressed them out because I gave them a new belief. It's why would they get higher grades 9 months later or show less depression? And I remember this one very skeptical statistician who sees it as his job to discredit people online. He got curious enough to come to my office when he visited my university. He's like, I don't get it. I tell my kids things for 15 minutes all the time and they forget it the second I stop talking. And you tell them something for 15 minutes and their lives are different a year later. It's got to be impossible. And in my head, I'm thinking, do you hear how you sound? Like, what kid of yours would ever listen? Like, you're so condescending all the time. And so I'm like, of course they don't listen to you. Like, listen to how you talk. I didn't say that though. But that's kind of true. That, like, I was a middle school teacher before I was an experimentalist. And so my interventions are a conversation with a kid that builds on how I've learned to talk to young people so that they remember.
And it's a reflection, right? It's not like the intervention is, I will tell you information. It's more getting them to reflect, right? Getting them to go
It is a
through their
reflection.
own.
It's very much influenced by the classic Norbert Schwartz theory of questionnaire design, that you're not just measuring stuff like a ruler, that the participant in a study is reading the survey questions, thinking that whoever wrote that believes that stuff is true. There's like Grice's maxim situation happening. And so for us, when I give a teenager an intervention, I'm aware of the fact that adults are constantly trying to change teenagers' beliefs, and they do so because they look down on teenagers. So the first thing I say in any intervention is, look, we're a bunch of lame adults. We don't remember what it's like to be a ninth grader. You know what it's like to be a ninth grader because you are one. We want this to help future students, and the only way that will happen is if we benefit from your expertise as a current ninth grader that has so much more experience and wisdom than we do. All we know is science, and we'll tell you some science, but you know what it's like to be you. And then now it's less weird when I ask them to say, hey, we told you some brain stuff about how people change. Would you mind convincing another ninth grader that this is true? Because it's natural to say that if I've already discredited my ninth grade credentials as a nerd professor and instead said, we want your perspective as a teenager. So it is a reflection, but the subtle thing is it's respect, right? It's like the Grice's maxim there is, I would only ask for your opinion if I didn't already think I knew everything myself, right? And if I thought that what you would say has some legitimacy and validity, and therefore I'm honoring, value, and respecting you. So I would say that, Richie and Cortland, like we were doing this work and we had techniques that we were using that some of them came from Elliot Aronson and cognitive dissonance theory, and others were just my intuitions having stood in front of a middle school classroom, terrified of losing the room. And actually every intervention I did, I piloted it first in inner city Oakland and I would pick an unruly classroom where the teacher was like, take these kids for a day. I don't even want to talk to them. And then my challenge was, could I keep the kids' attention for the whole class period? And if I couldn't, I was like, this intervention is not going to work. And then whatever I would say that I'm like, ooh, I got them there, that ended up in the intervention. So it was very much like a stand-up comic working out material before you host an award show or whatever. Before I solidify something in our interventions, I always made myself do it live in front of a bunch of like 13-year-olds who hate me. And if you think of it that way, there are things that 13-year-olds hear that they never forget. Now, it's usually disrespectful things that like treated them like garbage. But every once in a while, an adult like takes them seriously and values them and honors them, and then they don't forget it. So our hypothesis was, if I try to recreate that and then do it, and then there's a timing part, I do it at a time when you kind of need to use that mindset right away. Now you're remembering it not because I told you, but because it was functional for you. So like, think about Scarlett, told her the stress thing, she immediately got up skiing. Well, now it worked for her, right? It paid off. It allowed her to have a blast skiing. So later on in life, when she auditions for ballet, for example, she remembers that it was a functional thing for her. And that comes straight out of, I don't know if you know Jeremy Jameson's research at Rochester, he's my collaborator, but it's great reappraisal things. He like teach you how to reappraise stress before the GRE, and then he'll give you a practice GRE right away. So you have to use it when you're stressed out. And he did it because he thought it was a good thing to do. He wasn't testing it. But I always, and Jeff Cohen does this too, but I always think of, I'm going to give you a mindset. Then you have a chance to use it right away. And then the reason why you remember it is because it was functional, not because you care what this nerd professor thought.
Yeah, that's great. I can see where um, having an opportunity to use the strategy immediately helps to reconsolidate it in a way that is really more effective.
But then now you asked about, okay, how did we get to what we're doing now, which is instead of intervening on the kid, for example, we're trying to influence the adults in the kids' lives. So the way you get there is kind of two things. One is I looked back on all the interventions that worked, like our one to get teenagers to eat healthy food rather than junk food, or the bullying, one, or the stress one. And I was like, what do they all have in common? And I thought one common principle was the status and respect piece, that it always comes from a place of I'm honoring and valuing the young person. I'm having them be a mentor to someone else. Okay, so that was one thought. But the other thought, Richie, is, okay, now imagine a world in which I've changed your mindset temporarily, but you didn't have a context in which you could use the mindset I gave you. Either you didn't have an opportunity, or even worse, something in your context discredited the message I just gave you. And so we did a study where we did our growth mindset intervention, teaching ninth graders your brain can get smarter when you struggle. But then we did it in a random sample of public schools where they're in a lot of different kinds of math classes. And in some kinds of math classes, if you learn a growth mindset, you're resilient, you do your homework, you overcome challenge, then the teacher will say, that's amazing. You're a serious student. I'm invested in you. It pays off. In other classrooms, you're like, I love mistakes. I'm going to tell the teacher about my mistakes so we can fix them. And then the teacher's like, why did you make that mistake? I already told you that 5 times. So the fact you're making the mistake means you weren't paying attention. So get your act together and do the work before I'm going to help you. And that ends up being about half of classes in America, right? Because we've surveyed teachers. And that the teacher basically discredits the mindset that we gave the kid. And it's it's a contextual switch. It switches it off. And that was an empirical finding. It was a theory we had, took years to do the study, this national experiment. That was the finding. But then now you wonder, could you take those, for example, very fixed mindset teachers that are switching off the treatment and then change them? And if you did, then could you double the impact of the kid intervention? And so that was the question we asked, 2018. And it's just that's all I've been thinking about. That's why I wrote the book. All of our new empirical work is on changing the adults so they have what the design people would call an affordance for the kid's mindset, so that now the kid's like, this mindset was functional. It helped me meet my goals. And therefore it's something I'm going to use and hold on to.
That's great. You're wearing a hat that says Fuse. Can you explain to viewers what Fuse is, and a little bit about how you are actually implementing this now?
Yeah. So Fuse is simply put, it's our teacher growth mindset intervention, but it's bigger than that. It's really the teacher mentor mindset intervention. It started out as the answer to the question of, could you change the teachers so they afford a growth mindset more to students? And there was a whole long set of puzzles we had to resolve. So one is if I'm a teacher who creates a growth mindset culture in a classroom where now the kid can act on their better mindsets, what am I doing? Am I walking around saying mistakes are your friend? Do I have a Garfield poster that's oh, Mondays, time to learn from mistakes? It's not clear what you're doing, right? And so I had to go study people who were actually creating growth mindset cultures. And by study, I mean sit in the back of classes. So right after I got tenure, I took basically some time off and I sat in the back of this great calculus professor's class. His name is Uri Treisman, who's an amazing educator. He's basically America's greatest freshman calculus professor. He won the MacArthur for that work years ago. And I was like, what does he do? Like so, I mean, his results are amazing. 40% of all Black Americans with a PhD in math by the early 90s were graduates of his calculus class. It's like the single greatest creator of equity in professional mathematics.
Wow.
That's amazing.
There are 3 presidents of Division I universities. And I think, no, there's 5. Three of them are graduates of his class. Like, he's just an amazing mentor. But no psychologist has just sat in the back of his class and watched what he did. And so I did that I retook freshman calculus for 2 years. And it's amazing. I learned so much. And then I noticed that he does some stuff that's scalable, and he does other things that are weird and no one else would do if you weren't him. And I was like, I got to find more normal versions of this guy. And so we did a statistical analysis of educators in Texas, where we had a network of like 1,500 teachers. It's called on-ramps, and they're teaching college level courses, but in high schools. So the same physics class that my university, UT Austin, teaches, there are high school teachers across Texas who teach it, but the university grades the exams. So we found the most value-added teachers, the ones where growth mindset was functionally true there, where regardless of your struggle, you actually could improve in that class. And we found 20 of these hidden Uri Treismans and brought them to Austin and spent 3 days with them and had them explain what they do. And then we formed teams with them and designed new interventions. And we called them fellows. So these 20 fellows. My favorite of them was this guy, Sergio Estrada, who I write about in the book. And he's like imagine like, Yoda and Buddha taught high school physics. Is like, that's how I describe him. And it was awesome. And so we studied these like more normal people that were not these like, larger than life figures like Uri. And eventually we're like, there are some systematic things that they're doing. And of course they're the mentor mindset things, but they ask questions way more than they tell. They let students revise and resubmit exams and quizzes. They have a routine for explaining the culture of their class on the first day of class, et cetera, et cetera. And so at that point, we're like, can we train new novice teachers, more middle of the distribution teachers, to emulate the practices of that top 5% of instructors? And so Fuse was a program we created, a teacher professional learning program designed to educate educators on these mentor mindset practices. And we call it Fuse. Fuse stands for Fellowship Using the Science of Engagement. And it had to be an acronym because we learned things only scale in education if they're acronyms. And my contribution was to make sure the letters were fused together on the logo. So I'm pretty proud of that.
You don't
but
get
then,
that
yeah,
the paper. I'm glad I saw the hat.
yeah. So so we created the program, and so why is it called Fellowship? It's called Fellowship because when we had these 20 fellows, these Sergios, the top teachers, they loved it. They got to tell their colleagues they were fellows. Their superintendent sent them an invitation letter. We sent everybody like Yetis and moleskins. And the only reason we have a hat is because we sent everybody swag. I was calling, this is from Ski Town All-Stars. They have really good hats. I was like calling their head of sales saying, there's no way we can change the future of education unless Texas public school teachers get a 25% discount on these hats. And they're like, you're right. And so like I was obsessed with honoring and respecting these fellows. And then I was like, what if every teacher was just a fellow all the time? What if we just always treated teachers as though they're serious professionals who are using and implementing science in a community, and that they are admired and valued by third-party university people and by their administration? Like why does that just be these 20 people for 1 year? And so that was our insight, was rather than give a training where you come and do a workshop and we give you a binder and then you feel guilty you didn't do anything in the binder. And then, this is what happens to teachers, right? They learn a new method and they get a binder and they put it on the shelf and then they stare at it and feel bad that they didn't implement it in their class. We're like, let's just honor and value, respect people, kind of like we did with the kids in the mindset programs. And then at the end of the year, the teachers do a showcase where they present on what they tried in their class that year. And they do it, we have Carol Dweck join by Zoom. It's like they're getting valued, honored, and respected. And we find that makes people really open to change, and it changes their practices, but it also improves the well-being of the teachers. And probably the most shocking finding is we're seeing 9 months later, in a big randomized trial, pre-registered analysis, impacts of a quarter standard deviation or higher on like satisfaction with life. These are hard measures to move around sometimes in longitudinal studies. 50% reduction in burnout on these like validated inventories, because we're helping people basically be the kind of teacher they always wanted to be, which is engaging, supporting growth, etc. And then, of course, the student outcomes are 2x of what we saw when you only gave the treatment to the kid and didn't change the teachers. So you basically reproduce what you would have predicted from our previous study, where half the teachers were switching it off because they had a fixed mindset.
So much shared. We're doing very similar work, coming at it from a different angle, but very similar things. And I think that, one thing that is endlessly motivating to us is hearing things like what you just shared, where one of the more common phrases we hear uttered is like, this reminded me of why I became a teacher in the first place, and helping me reconnect with that. Maybe we could, just to round out this discussion, could just share some practical takeaways, for people. Some people listening might be teachers or educators, others might be parents. But a lot of this stuff actually is more than just how you relate to people between 10 and 25. A lot of this is just general, how we want to be treated, how we want to treat our friends, how we want to, actually a lot of this is just how to be human in hopefully in the best way possible. So maybe we could just end with some practical, what do you think are a few kind of concrete things that somebody could do in their lives and their relationships built on the research? And Richie, would love to hear kind of your thoughts as well from a lot of the similar work we do.
Yeah, I'd say that one of the most useful things I heard in my reporting was the power of the do-over, and the idea that there's a lot of parenting advice out there where you're supposed to be the perfectly self-controlled, self-disciplined, just Zen parent, and it's just hardly anyone feels like that. So then it feels like when we screw it up, now we've ruined our kids and cost ourselves thousands of dollars in therapy for the rest of their lives. But the reality is, you can go to your kids and say, hey, I didn't handle that the right way. I still need you to do this thing because it is really important, but I should have been more curious about what's getting in the way for you. Would you mind explaining to me what the issue was so we can try to work on it together? And the kid's probably going to remember the do-over more than the initial blow-up, or they'll laugh about the initial blow-up. So I'm not saying, look, there's a lot of parenting books that are like a diet book where it says, the best way to lose weight is to never eat any food you like. It's like, that's not practical advice. And I think similarly with parenting, it's not about being this perfect person. It's like having a mindset in which you're just trying to align your conversations with your kids with their long-term well-being and growth. And you're going to maintain high standards and expect them to do the things they need to do, but you're going to be flexible and work with them as they meet those standards, which means you're going to have to adjust. They'll have to adjust, but at least you know where you're pointing towards.
That's so true. It reminds me of one of the most meaningful conversations I ever had with my son was exactly that, where he was really upset. Like we had switched him into a different school, and it didn't go well in the school switch. And he was really upset years later that we had done that. And he kind of confronted me on it one time. And I actually said, you're right. Like, that was the wrong call. I did it because I loved you. And at the time I thought it was right, but it wasn't. In retrospect, you're right. Like if I had a do-over, I would do it differently. And and actually the whole thing opened up when I just said, I'm sorry. I wish I had made a different call. It was rooted in love, but it wasn't the right decision. And then we had like this really meaningful decision. So that's super helpful advice, David. Richie, What about you with all the kind of similar research and your own extensive work both in education and just the basic science of understanding what promotes well-being and flourishing. Any kind of takeaway thoughts that you think might be helpful?
Well, one of the important insights from recent work that we've done, which really is in many ways reflected in the work that you've done, David, is that flourishing is contagious. And so, with respect to advice for parents, one of the most important things that we can do as parents is really to nurture skills of flourishing ourselves and to not tell our kids explicitly, you need to do this or that, but simply to radiate with respect that you were describing, David, with curiosity. These are the kind of vibes, if you will, that when parents are emitting, will be naturally responded to in a positive way, I think, by our kids. And so it's a hard lesson to learn. And when you're in the throes of it, this is not, necessarily the most practical advice for what comes next. But in terms of the long haul and working on this in a kind of preventative way, I think it's really important.
Yeah. I think Cortland, the other just practical sum up is if I reflect on how I'm different as a parent now, uh it, I think I'm way more okay with crying than I was before, which sounds weird, but like when babies are crying, it's a very good signal you need to change something, like they're hungry, they're tired or whatever. Um when a 9-year-old's crying, sometimes it means because you're doing the right thing. And I was amazed how many of the students I interviewed of these great professors and great teachers talked about crying. Now, they didn't talk about crying because the teacher was making them ashamed. They talked about crying because the discipline was truly hard, right? And it's like for thousands of years, human beings didn't understand physics. And then we had to invent calculus to understand it. And then all these theorems and all these other things. And now we expect every 17-year-old in the country to learn it in 8 months, you know? So if you take that responsibility seriously, it's going to be uncomfortable for students and they're probably going to cry, but you're going to be there for them and support them, but not reduce the standards. And I think like that's another thing where just our kids being in distress feels like a sign we're doing it wrong, because it is kind of when they're babies because of how nurturing, works, but it's not really the case later. And sometimes it means you're doing it right. But
Yeah.
that as long as they're not crying because of shame and blame, but they're crying because you're asking them to do something that's a little uncomfortable, that they need to do, then it's okay. So that's another little tidbit that I've kind of come across.
Well, it's a beautiful note to end on. Yeah, so inspiring. Everything that you're doing, David, and it's really advanced the field. I know, Richie, as you said earlier, your work has been a great inspiration at the Center for Healthy Minds for all the work we do. We talk about it a lot. We reference your research a lot. And for all of you listening, if you haven't already read it, you should definitely check out 10 to 25. It's a lot of the stuff we're talking about here, a lot more detail and great stories. So definitely check that out. And David, hopefully we can have another conversation in the future, but really appreciate you taking the time today.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure thing. And we're just getting started. There's a lot more on the horizon for this stuff. So love to stay in touch.
Yes. Thank you so much, David. And keep up the amazing work. We love it.
Yeah, thanks, guys. I'm big admirers of yours. So I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you.